Good evening. I'm going to call to order the March 4th meeting of the Arlington Redevelopment Board, recorded by ACMi. Before we begin, I just want to make a couple of procedural notes on how this evening will work. Tonight, public hearings are going to be on Article 17, which relates to sign regulations, Article 18, which relates to the Floodplain District, 19, which relates to the Inland Wetland District, 20, which relates to review of religious and educational uses, and 22, which relates to correcting citation errors. There will be other public hearings held on the other zoning bylaw amendments proposed as we head into town meeting. So I would ask that people keep on scope to the zoning bylaw amendments being discussed at this meeting this evening, for which public hearings have been noticed. However, I will allow for a brief period of comment at the end if people would like to make comments on any other items. It's not on the agenda, but I'll allow it after we're done with the advertised public hearing before the organizational meeting. So with that said, I'm going to open item number 1, which is public hearing for 2019 annual town meeting, beginning with Article 17. Again, just a quick procedural note, the proponent, in this case, the consultant will have an opportunity to give a presentation. The board will ask questions, but not deliberate. It will allow for public comment and questions, and then bring it back to the board. Votes on all bylaw amendments will be taken March 27th. In additional time to submit comments from the public until then. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jenny Ray Aaron-Zwerko to introduce Article 17, which is a zoning bylaw amendment regarding sign regulations.
All right. So good evening. Tonight we are going to actually have Roger Eastman, AICP. He's with LWC. They are the consultant who helped the town with the sign bylaw regulation that is before the board tonight. He's going to run through a presentation about the article, and then we'll have time for comment from the board and open it up for other comments. So I think I'm actually just going to hand it to you.
Perfect.
Do that. Okay, great.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, and the members of the public who braved this winter weather to come on out here. Thank you. My name is Roger Eastman, as Jenny said, with Lisa Weiss Consulting. We're honored to have worked with your really great staff over the last few months to prepare for you amendments to your sign bylaw. Hang on a second. So as the chairman indicated, this is Article 17 to see if the town will vote to amend the zoning bylaw to update the sign regulations in its entirety, and that is Section 2 definitions and Section 6.2 signs. I'll let you read all the details there, and I know they're on your agenda as well. So a quick overview of the project. Your master plan zoning audit identified concerns with the sign regulations. Remember, that was in February of 2017. Staff started working on recodifying the zoning bylaw, which was adopted in February of 2018, and through that process identified the need for more time and more effort to work on the sign regulations. As a result of those decisions, we were hired in September to assist the city with ensuring that your sign regulations are consistent with state and federal law and the Arlington Master Plan. Of great importance was consistency with recent case law. I'm going to talk here in a moment about the Reed v. Town of Gilbert U.S. Supreme Court decision that fundamentally changed the way we regulate signs, and literally thousands of cities and towns across the country are going back into their sign code and looking at it as a result of that decision. The town wanted to ensure that the standards reflect the different places, the different geographies within the town, and to make sure that your sign bylaw was well organized, straightforward, easy to use, well illustrated, so that it was easy for not only staff to administer, but any member of the public to be able to pick it up and use it. And obviously we wanted to ensure that it was up to date with the best practices. I'm not going to go through all the details here, but we started with a conference call with city staff, got to know them in September of last year. We've been working very closely with mostly Erin. She did a lot of the stakeholder interviews in the community workshop with some of her team in October, November. We wrote what we call a sign audit, a analysis and recommendations report, what's good about the sign bylaw, what needs some help, and some recommendations on how to update the bylaw. I was here when that report was presented to present to the zoning bylaw working group. We then jumped right into working on an admin draft for staff review, and then we're able to release the public draft in preparation for this meeting with the Arlington Redevelopment Board. So very quickly, I'm not an attorney, I don't pretend to be an attorney, but it's really important that as a planner I understand what happened in Reed v. Town of Gilbert. And very quickly, Mr. Reed was a pastor in the town of Gilbert, a community southeast of Phoenix, Arizona. He has a very small church, no fixed location, and he tended to move his church around as he found accommodations that didn't cost him money for rent. And because these events were on a Sunday, he would put out a notice very much like this that invited people to come and attend his church. And this is where he ran into problems with the town of Gilbert, because the town of Gilbert classified that sign as a temporary directional sign relating to a qualifying event. Quite the mouthful, but they made a very distinctive decision as to what that type of sign was, and then they set up certain regulations, as you can see at the bottom, for how long or where that sign may be placed. And in this particular instance, these signs related to the church meeting could only be up 12 hours before the event and 1 hour afterwards. His church services were at 10 a.m. on a Sunday morning, and putting up the sign at night wasn't going to be effective. So we put them up in the afternoon. Hence the problem with inconsistency with the town rules. The difference was that political signs may be up 60 days before a primary election, 15 days before a general election, and ideological signs may be up for an indefinite period of time. And after a long series of court decisions in the lower court, this landed up with the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, Gilbert, you have content-based regulations. And that, under the First Amendment, is not allowed. And the U.S. Supreme Court confirmed a number of other decisions that they've made. So content-based regulation is really about what the sign says. If it's a real estate sign or a political sign or something else, you regulate based on that message. Content-neutral regulation is time, place, and manner-based. Nothing to do with the message. So whether it's political, real estate, or advertising car tires, as long as the standards are relative to how long it may be up, where it may be up, and how it may be placed, then it's content neutral. I just want to run through the sign regulations just to give you a quick overview. I know there are handouts in the back. But we set up your sign bylaw consistent with the existing zoning bylaw. So we started with general provisions, establishing the purpose of the sign bylaw, the authority for it, how it applies, regulations for substitution of commercial messages versus non-commercial messages, and then certain exemptions as well. We then set up an administration and procedures section, working very closely with staff to mirror your existing procedures for permanent signs and sign special permits. The temporary sign permit section is new. And then we set up very clear standards broken into categories, again, with the intent of making it easy to use. So the general restrictions related to location, they may not be on a roof, they may not be in the public right-of-way unless there's certain circumstances, are established in the location restrictions. We clearly identify what signs are prohibited. We clearly explain what sign display regulations are in place. No happy wavy guys, those vertical things that move in the wind, or no other signs that move in the wind. Clear standards so that signs can't flash and blink, and so on. And then we set up in a different section, 6.2.4, how you measure sign area, sign height, what the standards for illumination are, how a sign structure may be installed, the requirement for a building permit, and then basic requirements for sign maintenance. The rest of the code then is broken up into two sections, permanent signs and temporary signs. And we set up your standards mostly in a series of tables. Over the years, we find that that really helps the user understand and use the code. And the first decision was, instead of allowing signs by individual zoning district, to group like zoning districts into sign districts. So all the single-family residential zones are in the residential sign district with your 2-family and 3-family zoning districts. We then set up a sign district for your business signs, for industrial signs, for multi-use signs, and then for open space. And then within each of those sign districts, working again with staff, we agreed on what types of signs are appropriate. So we're now making very place-based decisions on what signs are allowed within your town. Once we then knew where the signs would be allowed by sign district, we established the standards, as I said before, in a series of tables, typically 2 per page, sometimes 1 per page, with a simple graphic illustrating the sign. Definitions, of course, are in a different section, and then standards in this tabular format. And where we realized that we needed different signs for different sign districts, we included those in the table, for example, for monument signs or for wall signs, whereas an awning sign, or in this case a bracket sign, those standards are not going to change across different sign districts. We then set up similar standards for temporary and portable signs. This got to be a little more interesting because this is really where Reed and the Supreme Court decision came into play. And we had to be very thoughtful. I've been working on signs now since just after the Reed decision. And this is becoming our chosen approach to, in a content-neutral way, regulating temporary and portable signs. And so you can see at the bottom, for example, the yard sign type 1, 2, or 3 could have any message on it. But it's pretty easy to understand that this yard sign type 2 is those that are typically used by a realtor to advertise property for sale or for lease. But it could also have any other message on it that somebody chooses to place there. We then created a non-conforming sign section, updating pretty much what you have today, and then spent a lot of time working on sign definitions. Some of your definitions in your current bylaw needed some cleanup. We've added a number of new ones consistent with best practices. And those are now in section 2 of the article. So that concludes my presentation. Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer any questions. And I'm here for the evening or as long as you need me. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. I'm going to begin with Jean for questions from the board.
No questions.
David.
All right. Thank you for the presentation, and I just want to acknowledge the work of the zoning bylaw working group, which I was a member of, and the members, I don't know, there are a number of you here. You want to raise your hands? Not all of them are here, but they put in a lot of time reviewing the drafts of this work and giving high-level and very detailed guidance to the consultant, and I really don't think that we could have gotten this far without the work of the group. So, thanks to everyone. I hadn't really gotten a chance myself to go through things at a very detailed level until leading up to this meeting. So I do have some questions I wanted to go through, and some of them are fairly detailed, but I think it's worth asking the questions when we can have a discussion about it. So in section 6.2.1D, which talks about substitutions and interpretations, and that's basically where it says there's a great deal of leeway in the content of the sign. And assuming that that's largely due to Reed v. Gilbert and trying to make that clear. But I'm interested in looking at the interplay between that and 6.2.2A1, which is where we look at where a sign permit is required. Because it says each sign and change of copy, i.e. changing of the face or letters on a sign, requires a separate sign permit except as allowed in section 6.2.1D. But since that other section seems to allow a very broad leeway in changing what's on a sign, how do you know where you need to apply for a new permit versus not?
Do you want to take it, Doug, or?
I'm not sure I think I understand the gist of what you're getting at, but is this more of a process-oriented question, or?
Well, it wasn't entirely clear to me reading it. How do I know whether I need to apply for a permit or not when I'm making a change to an existing sign?
I don't know that I'm the ideal person to address that specific issue. If you'd like me to just sort of speak generally about it.
Let me kick it off, and then you can add your legal comment afterwards. So the intent of this is to allow for somebody who has got a sign permit, a commercial message, to substitute a different message that may be a non-commercial message, so it may be political or ideological or whatever, without the need for a permit.
But if someone has a commercial sign permit,
Okay?
and they want to make a change on that, change of wording,
So commercial to commercial requires a sign permit.
that will always require.
So an example might be you have a simple cabinet sign and you want to change it from Joe's Books to Bob's Boots. So the town is requiring a sign permit for that change of a commercial message. But it's the substitution of not favoring commercial speech that allows you to substitute a non-commercial message.
So that was the way I interpreted it, referring back to the earlier section. But it seems that if we want to make this simple, we don't want people to have to go back to earlier sections and cross-reference it and figure out what it means in order to understand if they need a permit or not. So I'd like to see us make it crystal clear right there in that section that, you know, if they're making a change from commercial to commercial, they need a permit. So another process question in the very next section, actually in 6.2.2A2, which is the review and approval process. And that lays out the process for what you actually have to do to get a permit. Application required, review, and then determination. And in the review point, that red highlighted sentence there talks about the possibility of referring an application to the ARB, which could happen, and then the ARB would make a determination on the permit. But the very next bullet under determination says the building inspector shall determine, and that doesn't necessarily logically follow if the permit has been referred to the ARB. So I think that just needs to be cleaned up a little bit logically, because there will obviously be circumstances where the building inspector does not make the determination.
Can I add something to that? It might be helpful to know under what circumstances the permit will be sent to the ARB, because right now it's standardless. So I think it would be helpful to add that also.
Yeah, that's a good point. Jumping down to 6.2.2b, temporary sign permits. Subsection 2, duration of a temporary sign permit. It talks about a limitation on wall banners being 60 days, and then says there's no time limitation for A-frame signs for which a temporary sign permit is required. And that seems a little confusing until you get to section 6.2.6 later, which goes into more detail about exactly why that is, that you need a temporary sign permit for an A-frame, but it doesn't expire. So I think at least referencing 6.2.6 there, so that if somebody wants to dig into that apparent logical inconsistency, they can, would be good. If not actually trying to explain it a little better as to why a temporary sign permit doesn't actually have a time limit in that circumstance. Next thing, there's a bullet point right under there, application required. And it says no more than one temporary wall banner sign per 150 linear feet of property frontage shall be allowed at any one time. And then says the property manager or property owner shall be responsible for determining which tenants are entitled to signs. So what happens in a commercial block with multiple stores where you could envision a scenario where there could be sign turnover happening in multiple stores simultaneously, where stores could need temporary signage? And I'm thinking, could this be a situation where well, first, is that unnecessarily restrictive in limiting it to one and leaving it at the discretion of the property owner? And second, is this a situation where since you can apply for a special permit for any variance from these limitations, maybe that should be made more explicit here than in a situation where someone might want more than one temporary sign in a situation like this, that they could apply for a special permit, so it doesn't seem just so absolute that they can't have one.
Would you like a response, a little background to this?
Sure. I mean,
It's
absolutely. If
I'm not sure of your protocols.
If I'm off base
No.
or making things more confusing, please step
This
in.
has probably been one of the most difficult issues to resolve. And it's really centered on your typical strip shopping center. When I first wrote this provision back in the city of Flagstaff a number of years ago, we have strip shopping centers that would have 10, 15, 20 stores in them. And so the idea was to limit the number of signs that would be allowed out in front of that strip shopping center. And this ties into the temporary sign section later on, where that 150 linear foot standard is repeated. You make a really good point, though, where on Massachusetts Avenue here, where you have individual stores not part of a strip shopping center, are you likely to have a number of temporary wall banner signs on each of those businesses? The answer is, yeah, maybe. But unfortunately, you can't regulate them as commercial temporary banners anymore. You just have to say banners generally. And I haven't been able to find a better way around it. If you, sir, have a better idea, I'd love to hear it. Otherwise, I don't know of another way to get around it.
Well, what about just making it more explicit in that paragraph that you can apply for a special permit if in this situation? Because it does, I mean,
Is that the intent, to allow more
Well,
temporary signage under the...
I don't see how we can possibly have that limitation, given the configuration of so many of our businesses here in Arlington.
It's not that they can't have signs, they can each have their own sign.
Well, I'm just thinking if multiple businesses are changing their signs or turning over simultaneously, then this would only allow one of them to have a sign.
You could do one per business.
That would be acceptable to me, but that's not what this says.
I know. Because there are other parts of this where they're allowing one sign per business on the frontage.
Yeah.
The question is whether that's okay for huge banners also.
Yeah, I mean, as long as we don't have like an entire building with, you know, a dozen businesses in it that perpetually only has wall banners on it, you know, I think we'd want each business as needed to be able to have a wall banner.
But I think, sir, in a situation where you have individual buildings or individual stores not in a strip shopping center, they would be allowed one temporary wall banner per year for 60 days. This, I think we could clarify to apply to your shopping center, and I think that might resolve the concern.
Okay.
Would
Yeah,
it?
because I mean, these are, to a large extent, you know, the way our shopping is set up is large single buildings that
Yep.
are subdivided into small
Block-sized
shops.
buildings,
And
right.
it's not clear from the
Right.
language of that whether more than one wall banner would be allowed on that entire structure.
Correct.
That's what I'm getting.
We'll make the clarification relative to the shopping centers, as I've seen further up Massachusetts Avenue here. Perfect, thank
All
you.
right, jumping ahead, 6.2.3B, 5, inflatable balloons, spinners, strings of flags and pennants, feather banners, etc. I remember asking a question related to this at the very beginning of this process, and then I kind of lost track of the issue. But does this in any way relate to the inflatable holiday decorations that some people put on their lawns?
I would argue not. But that comes down to your code enforcement staff, but I've been in code enforcement, I managed a team for a while, I would say no. But maybe the town would like to answer that.
I mean, they can be affected by the movement of air,
Yeah.
but they also often have a fan keeping them inflated.
Well, exactly.
Right. I would probably say no, like Roger did, because those aren't necessarily signs.
Yeah.
They're decoration. So I would say that this doesn't apply to that, but that's just my opinion of it.
So this highlights the dilemma of the post-Reed world.
Yeah.
So before Reed, First Amendment jurisprudence was not necessarily highly understandable, but it was doctrinal, and there were lots of little compartments for all kinds of different things. And you could say confidently that this is commercial, this is how we treat non-commercial, this is how we treat something based on, whether it's a limited public forum or not. This is how we treat something that's a residential sort of quote-unquote decoration. This is how we treat something, that's a flag. After Reed, there's this inconsistent evaluation of what constitutes content-based, and whether or not something like a symbol, holiday decoration, is really content-based or not. I'd say that on the spectrum of things that we would want to be more conservative about, this is probably, in terms of holiday decorations, not something that is a good thing to delve into. Because even if we tried to carve out an exception for that, I think it'd be more trouble than it's worth. Once we say, this shall not apply to holiday decorations, that really is starting to zone in on saying, we've got something codified in the bylaw that says this doesn't apply to something that is based on what it's expressing.
Well, I mean, I'm more concerned about a scenario with, say, a citizen who, for whatever reason, doesn't like that kind of display, seeks enforcement of this provision to seek to have the display removed, and wondering how the town would respond to that.
I think we'd be in a, if I may, I think we'd be in a better position to say that it's our interpretation of this language, that it's intended by the scope of our discussions and it's sort of plain reading, not to apply to something of that tenor in nature, than to try to carve out a specific exception in it that would highlight how much that exception is essentially content-based. And I'm not conceding at all that that should be construed as content-based at all. I'm just saying that the world has definitely gotten more complicated and a lot less predictable in the sort of post-Reed jurisprudence.
Okay.
So can I ask a question related to that? So somebody in my neighborhood had this great Frosty the Snowman in front of their yard, and it was illuminated, and it had a hat, and mechanically it would tip its hat every few seconds. What's the answer? Is it covered by B5 or not?
I would say no.
Yep.
I don't think it is.
What would you point to say it's not?
So the overall beginning point of B is prohibited signs.
Yeah.
I understand that that's not the best way of hinging it, given the fact that it says inflatable balloon spinners, strings, flags, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't list something that I think neatly fits into that. It says affected movement by air or other atmospheric or mechanical means.
This was the hat with the
But
mechanical.
it says, but the sort of preface to that is inflatable balloons, spinners, strings of flags, pennants, feather banners, fixed aerial displays, streams, or other devices. I guess, trying to interpret that in the most reasonable way possible, I would just say that I don't know that an inflatable snowman fits neatly into any of those things, and therefore we're just not, seeking to regulate that type of item. The difficulty with this is that, as folks are already clearly highlighting, how do we treat one of those reindeer that's illuminated and moves its head up and down?
Right,
I mean,
same thing.
there are an endless number of sort of permutations on some of these questions, and one of the real frustrations is whether or not Gilbert ever intended to sort of open this box so that we couldn't say something so clear as, this is not supposed to affect residential holiday displays. But even some of those distinctions between residential and non-residential have gotten a lot harder for bodies to articulate. And that's one of the real values of having a consultant that's worked with a lot of different municipalities, a lot of different parts of the country, so seeing these same issues come up over and over. I'm sorry, it's a very long answer to it.
No, it's an important discussion to have. So, number 8 on that same list. Oops. Yep. No,
No? Keep going.
lost it.
At the top.
Right at the top.
Yeah, that one. Signs for businesses no longer in existence or for a product or service no longer being sold. So, I'm thinking in terms of historical or cultural significance. And for instance, the Citgo sign, which if Citgo no longer existed, people in Boston would have a hard time letting go of the Citgo sign because of historical or cultural associations. So I don't know if we have any commercial signage in Arlington which rises quite to that level of cultural significance, but it's possible that there could be something, maybe smaller scale, but special in Arlington that people wouldn't want to see forced to be removed simply because the business no longer exists. So I wonder if there's a way to take that into account without getting into content.
Mr. Chairman, we could probably refer to landmark signs or signs of historical or cultural significance in that context. Good catch, thank you.
Does that also apply to like murals on buildings?
The sign bylaw, sir, is neutral on murals, consciously. Because it gets very, very tricky as your town attorney or town council.
Yes, I know,
will
it
tell
could
you.
be art, it could be sac.
Exactly, yeah.
Can I add one other thing? I'm sorry. This is something important, and I'm not correcting Roger because I think this is a pretty nuanced point. But READ does not stand for the proposition that every facet of an ordinance must be content neutral. What it stands for is that in its narrowest reading, is that regulation of non-commercial speech is subject to strict scrutiny if it's based on its content. So the reason strict scrutiny sort of becomes de facto you can't do it is it's very, very hard to meet a strict scrutiny standard. But for something like the old Schwab Mill, if there's some signage that was still up that was reflecting the services offered at the mill or something like that, I think that there would be a potentially compelling case that's sort of documented by the town's historical commission that's got a real basis for support for why we're treating something like this in a special way. Not just because it's a general, sort of old sign that a few people like, but because this is something that maybe is a documented property on our historical inventory, and that's a facet of it. So I think that it's not just to say that we always have to say no, there can't be any content-based view of anything. It's just very, very hard. This is probably one of the areas that would be a good example of a really strong case for why we're treating it the way we are.
Yeah, that's a good point. Just a couple more things. Next section down, display restrictions, C, number 3. This again goes back, and I think maybe we've already answered this question, but my concern again was the effect of this on holiday lighting, and particularly the newer ones that use lasers that project things all over your house and have motion and things like that. And
this is harder. I will say that this is a pretty specific. I don't know how Arlington feels personally about those holographic displays and that type of holiday lighting. I'll be honest, I really have to think about that a little bit in terms of...
I'm pretty sure I've seen them in Arlington.
I'm not saying you haven't. I'm saying I don't know how the town feels about them. I mean, I'd have to think about this one a little bit. I'm not sure. It's to me, it's a little bit of a closer call than the snowman with the hat example.
And again, Mr. Chairman, if I may, the intention here is really intended for commercial displays rather than a single-family home, celebrating the holidays as they choose.
And I did have a question, because maybe I missed it, but I did, we did have some discussion in the working group about signage that we've seen in some places where like a restaurant is projecting its name on the sidewalk, and maybe it's rotating and being projected. Is that covered somewhere in here?
It's number 3.
That is
Number
this,
3.
and we're prohibiting that.
Yes.
Okay. Personally, I'm not 100% sure I want to prohibit that, but if it's too hard to make distinctions between that and really undesirable uses, I don't know. All right, just one more thing, then I have some very minor typos that I'll just give to the staff later. But sorry, I'm scrolling to it. in section 6.2.6A1, and this is actually bringing us back to portable and temporary signs, where I started my comments. Yep. Just a little, yep. So in that first one, A1, it refers to an exception, except that A-frame and upright signs, I'm not sure, but I couldn't find a definition of upright signs anywhere.
It is, if I may, just skip down to the definitions section under,
Yeah, we took it out.
portable, I'm getting there. There it goes.
Where?
What page?
In the definition, it includes also known as upright signs,
Oh.
and sandwich board signs.
Okay.
So to your point, sir, and A-frame and upright signs in 6.26A1 should be eliminated. We took them out elsewhere. That's
Okay.
one that slipped by.
All right,
Okay,
okay, that's it. Thank you for bearing with me.
Ken,
thank you.
Oh, I'm good.
I have some typos that I'll submit to the staff, but other questions. So at this time, I'm going to open up for public comment. Please raise your hand. I'll call on you. Please stand, state your name and address for the record, and please be brief and be respectful. Actually, yes, if you'd like to step up to the podium where there's a microphone so the entire room can hear you, that would be great. So we will open public comment now. Mr. Loretti,
Nobody got it.
please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chris Loretti, 56 Adams Street. May I begin with some questions, or do you just want comments?
You can ask questions.
A couple, there's quite a bit of material here. I didn't get a chance to go through it in detail, but I did have a few questions. First, I'm a little confused about the handout that was given, because it refers to something called a track changes version. And I'm wondering, what are those changes relative to?
Jenny.
Yeah, the changes are relative to comments we received from the zoning bylaw working group and from some board members, so we incorporated them. So it's still the hearing draft that was posted on February 14th, and with track changes through February 27th.
So it's not, I just want to be clear, it's not track changes relative to the existing bylaw.
Oh, no, this is a whole brand new section.
That's right.
Yeah, this is all brand new.
One of the questions I had, and I didn't see this in the existing bylaw, is our current bylaw has been very effective in prohibiting billboards in town, calling them non-accessory signs. And I'm wondering whether this revised bylaw offers a similar level of protection.
I'll defer to Roger to answer that, but I know there is a section.
It's under prohibited signs, sir, and billboards are prohibited. Oh, or not, excuse me. Oh, we've got a whole new billboard section in here, right?
So it's,
Thank you. Keep going.
It's
There
6-28.
you go, there you go.
no person, firm, association, or corporation shall erect, display, or maintain a
There you
billboard
go.
except as exempted by,
Yep.
Great, thank you.
essentially from the existing bylaw.
The other question I had is related to LED signs. And we had some activity over recent years with these in town, and after one of the gas stations used LED lighting to display the price of gasoline, town meeting then amended the zoning bylaw to prohibit that, and then several years later, they were approved again at another gas station. And I'm wondering, will this bylaw allow the types of things we were going to have, CVS or Walgreens putting up LED signs that say Coca-Cola 99 cents or $1.29 when the price changes?
So I think actually we do address LED signage at various stores. We didn't, I think we made a conscious choice not to have the monument sign or sort of signage, so I'm gonna here, scrolling through here.
So,
It's under prohibited though,
Yeah.
signage.
Page 6.7.
But then it's also, we talked about how to handle that type of signage that you're referencing, Mr. Moretti. In the, it's in two different places, basically, under the monument signs, which is the type of sign that might display something like what you're talking about.
Your consultants say something different as
Oh,
we
sorry.
speak.
Okay, Roger.
Do you want to?
It was,
Yeah, I was just pointing to the section of the code that prohibits electronic message entries or
That's what I was
electronic displays, just as Jenny was saying.
right.
But we do allow single color LED signs. So those are the kinds of signs you'd see in a drive-through when you're confirming your order. They're very small little red letters on a dark green or black background. So we would allow those, and under this draft anyway, you would be allowed to do gas station signs as LED signs rather than neon or something else.
I'm confused by that. When you say gas station signs, do you mean
The
on,
price, gas station price sign.
right, on the large pedestal sign at the corner, or do you mean on the pump itself?
It would be at the corner on the monument sign.
So then we could have CVS and Walgreens doing the same thing with the price of Coca-Cola. Is that right?
I don't think so.
Don't think so.
No,
No.
based upon, there are two different types of signs, I think, as codified.
Well, I guess what I'm curious is why is the price of Coca-Cola different than the price of gasoline?
I need to look into it further, so we'll accept it as a comment for now.
Okay, why don't we turn that into a comment and say, I hope that wouldn't be allowed. But my main reason for getting up here is really relating to the section on temporary and portable signs, because it appears to me you've mashed together temporary and portable and essentially created this new category called portable signs, which in fact are an additional permanent sign that does not require permitting, does not count towards your limit of how much signage you have on a property, and has no limit in time. And I'll give you some examples of what I read as being possible based on this portable sign definition. I have in the past complained about additional signage at the Sims site. For example, this is a development that your board spent considerable amount of time on for the signage. And what I complained about was what I called a temporary sign on the sidewalk advertising apartments for rent. And to be honest, I'm not 100% sure what was on the sidewalk or next to the sidewalk. But as I read what you've written here, they could put in what's called a portable sign, move it off the right-of-way, or perhaps mount it next to their current side. Could be 32 square feet and says, say, apartments for rent. And it could be up there forever. And I don't think that sort of thing should be allowed. Similarly, as I read it, what I'm also seeing now are landscapers putting signs up, sometimes in the right-of-way, sometimes right next to the sidewalk advertising their services. I'm seeing them up there now during the winter. That, again, appears to me to fit the definition, or could very easily fit the definition of a portable sign. Again, no permit, no time limit, and it's just contributing to the visual clutter in the town. So I really think you need to take a very close look at what you're allowing for one of these so-called portable signs, because there's no limitations, there's no regulations essentially, except perhaps in the type of sign, whether you call them a type 1, type 2, or something else. But other than that, once they meet that criteria, there's just not any limitations on, or very little limitation on them, I shouldn't say not any. Finally, the last thing I just want to mention is on these A-frame signs, apparently they are allowed in the right-of-way under some conditions. I think a 4-foot passage is too small to allow people to pass in both directions, or for somebody in a wheelchair to pass somebody walking. I don't feel, if I'm walking on the sidewalk, that I should have to go out of my way to avoid one of these signs. So I think that's all I have. I appreciate you considering these comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other comments, public comments, et cetera? We will continue to accept comments. I'm sorry. Yeah, Mr. Dokia.
Bob Riddosher on Columbia Road. As a follow-up to Mr. Loretti, who actually goes about town citing violations or incorrect signs or whatever? It seems that, to his point, there are a lot of them around, but who is actually responsible to kind of issue a citation or follow up on it? Is there anyone?
The building inspector. It's under
These guys-
inspectional services. That's
Do
the same-
they
the
have
same as
somebody?
now.
Yeah, okay, but they're busy with a lot of other things, so they're really not doing it, so that is an issue. The other one is, nothing we've talked about applies to store window signs so far. Is that included in any of this?
Yes. There are different sections that relate to this. We can bring them up.
Yes, so window signs have its own section.
Okay, I thought there were regulations on it, and several years ago when they were talking about sign issues and so forth, it seemed like there was going to be a lot of enforcement about clutter on windows. And I can show you an example of one right now that I think is horrendous, and it makes it look like someplace in the back streets of Chelsea. But no one seems to be going around making a point of any of this. And I'll leave a couple of photos with you showing you what I'm talking about. And I'd like to see it addressed because it's a little bit, people have to look at these things. Neighbors have to look across the street and see this stuff. But anyhow, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments, questions? Related to the sign bylaw. We will continue to accept written comments via email to the board, staff, other members of the board, having questions on comments. For that, the deliberation. So Article 17 is closed. Okay, moving on to Article 18, Floodplain District. Thank you, Roger. Appreciate your time.
I really appreciate you having me. Thank you. And to the members of the board, thanks for some insightful comments. What's fascinating, if I may just interject, every community is so different, the issues that come up. It really makes my job interesting. So thanks.
I'm going to wait for Gene to come back and then we'll move on to Article 18.
Okay, I have a meeting.
8 to 10, she's going to be.
But if you have some time,
Otherwise, we can.
yeah, feel free to.
Very great. Very nice. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, good to see you. Yeah.
Safe travels back.
Yes, this is good. Yes, you.
We'll be in touch.
Yeah, I'll give you one.
Okay, perfect. Do you have any numbers? I'll just go to. Sure.
Yes.
No, it's okay. You ready?
Ready.
Okay.
We're back on Article 18.
Do I actually need to hold this? No. Can I put it here? So this is for Article 18, and what you see up here is actually just the warrant article filing. And the second slide is just explaining what we've done here is similar to Article 19. We identified this section of the zoning bylaw as well as the next section of the zoning bylaw as being inconsistent with the Arlington Conservation, the wetland regulations, with the zoning bylaw, and we wanted to make those two consistent. So both of these articles relate back to that same point. The corrections for this one included correctly referring to the Town of Arlington bylaw for wetlands protection, which it had not done previously, to make the section internally consistent with both the zoning bylaw and the Concom regulations, as well as correcting some outdated section references that were either sections within the bylaw or sections that referred to an agency that didn't exist or has a different name as of today. We've noted this previously to the board, but for everybody's consumption, it does not change the review process that the Conservation Commission has in place. And relevant to this point, I did receive a letter from Nathaniel Stevens, the chair of the Arlington Conservation Commission, on behalf of the commission, which I thought I might read into the record now, or I can wait until after, whatever you would like.
You can do it now.
Okay. All right, this was addressed to myself and also is being sent to town meeting members and the editor of the Arlington Advocate. Among the warrant articles that will be under consideration for the Springs town meeting are Articles 18 and 19. So this is in reference to the next article as well, which is for the Inland Wetlands District. They propose changes to the floodplain and inland wetlands overlay districts of the Arlington zoning bylaw. Recently, the Arlington Conservation Commission has received a number of inquiries regarding these proposed amendments and has heard concern expressed that the proposed zoning bylaw changes may weaken important provisions that have been in place for many years to protect Arlington's wetland resource areas. The Conservation Commission would like to stress that the proposed zoning bylaw changes would not impact the Conservation Commission's administration of the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act and Arlington's Wetland Protection Bylaw and wetland regulations. The Conservation Commission does not administer the town zoning bylaw. Moreover, the Conservation Commission's wetland protection regulations are ever evolving to tackle important matters like climate change resilience. These rules provide more stringent protection of wetland resource areas and their adjacent upland areas than the State Wetlands Protection Act. The floodplain and inland wetlands overlay districts provisions in the zoning bylaw do not modify the separate wetland protection bylaw and regulations administered by the Conservation Commission. Some say they instead complement them. At the request of the Arlington Redevelopment Board and Department of Planning and Community Development, the Conservation Commission has noted inconsistencies between the language in these sections of the zoning bylaw and the wetlands laws of the Conservation Commission. While the Conservation Commission is pleased to serve as a resource to our fellow Arlington residents and town boards and departments, the Commission is neutral on matters of zoning administration and these proposed zoning amendments. Nathaniel Stevens, Chair. So,
Gene.
I think this is the appropriate thing to do to conform our regulations to the Conservation Commission regulations. I'll only talk about the floodplain now because I have a comment on the inland wetlands afterward. And I especially appreciate that we redefined slightly floodplain districts so it's consistent with the Conservation Commission definition of floodplain district. And for those of you who have the copy in front of you, we added the underlined two sentences in 5.7.2, which brings us up to speed with the Conservation Commission. So I think these are appropriate changes.
Thanks. David?
I agree. These are appropriate changes. I did want to bring up one item that I think needs to be corrected, and I think somehow got dropped in the editing process, and that ironically has to do with the special permit process before this board under 5.7.5C. And it appears that some language is missing between the introductory sentence and the three standards that follow immediately after it. I'd actually like to defer to Steve Revelak, who looked at this in more detail from the zoning bylaw working group, to perhaps explain in more detail the language that's missing, but I agree with him that this is missing, and that this doesn't logically seem to make sense without the missing language or something like it in here.
Go ahead. Mr. Black.
Steve Revelak, 111 Sunnyside Avenue. As Mr. Watson said, there is a place where there's an opening paragraph in the set of standards, and when reviewing these changes, I thought that there was something missing, so I went back to the pre-recodification version of our zoning bylaw, found a missing paragraph, and I believe I tried to quote it in my comments, but yeah, we missed a paragraph.
Okay, we will put the paragraph back. I don't know what the paragraph is, so I'll look at your comments.
Well, it actually sets.
It's like the introductory, like preamble here, right?
Well, it actually sets forth the requirement for issuing a special permit for anything that doesn't meet the standards that are listed.
Okay.
But without saying that, there's really no requirement to issue special permits otherwise.
The only thing I can think of is that it's something that we missed when we were doing our rules and regulations as well, that we may have deleted it with the intention of putting it there, but I'd need to read, I will look at the paragraph and understand what happened there, and if, of course, it belongs back in here, we'll put it back in here.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good. Ken? Nothing from me. I will open up public comment. Same rules apply. Please raise your hand. Step to the mic, name and address. Any comments? All right. Moving on to Article 19.
This is essentially the same. So this is the warrant article on the screen, and it's really the same as the last warrant article 18, which is to correct the references, make the section internally consistent with the wetland protection, as well as the Conservation Commission regulations, and then correct citations. Does not change the review process that's already in place by the Conservation Commission.
Jim?
Again, I think this is necessary and appropriate to do. I'll point out that we need to have the definition of perennial rivers, brooks, and streams, which I've given wording to the staff that I suggested they insert right there as defined by the State Wetlands Protection Act and regulations, so you know where to look. And I've given them the wording. That's my only comment.
Good. Thank you. David?
No comments.
Ken? Any public comments? Yes, ma'am. Please step to the mic and name and address.
Beth Malachek, 20 Russell Street. I'm just curious, and if I would appreciate some elucidation. It appears to me, a layperson, that you're redefining wetlands with the insertion of perennial.
Do you want to actually?
I mean, I can
Go
say
ahead.
something about that.
Yeah.
The Wetlands Protection Act makes a distinction between perennial and intermittent streams. And all this does is make it consistent with what the Conservation Commission does and with state law. If you didn't have perennial in there, any little sort of thing that ran for a couple of days, like in a big rainstorm, would be considered a stream and would expand the jurisdiction immensely. So this is just
My concern is
consistent with
with
the current.
vernal streams.
No, vernal pools are different, they're not covered by that. These are streams, brooks, rivers, not vernal pools.
Are there any specific creeks and brooks in Arlington that this applies to? For
It-
instance, is Millbrook perennial?
Yes, it applies to every stream and brook in town, except the Conservation Commission told me during real high rain, you get a little stream along the side of a bike path for a short period of time. It doesn't apply to that. If we had taken out the word perennial, it would have applied to that, which made no sense. But perennial rivers, brooks, and streams are every existing river, brook, and stream in Arlington, with the exception of that very small intermittent stream along the side of the bike path, according to what the Conservation Commission told us. So this is consistent with their jurisdiction and what we should be doing.
So one, my understanding is that a wetland doesn't include vernal rivers and creeks, and that their ecosystems are very important.
But-
Two, I understand that in some of the materials related to this entire process, Mill Brook is mentioned as a redevelopment corridor, and that gives me serious pause and concern. So I'm curious as to whether this change is to accommodate development along the Mill Brook
No.
corridor.
Absolutely not. It does not make any change to the existing regulation of Millbrook. And again, you need to think of, there's a big distinction between vernal pools and streams that run a short period of time. Vernal pools support certain sorts of little creatures because the pools are only there for a short period of time, but enough for the creatures to spawn and exist, and then the pools dry up. That doesn't happen in intermittent streams. So there's an important distinction, which is why the State Wetlands Act and our Conservation Commission regulates vernal pools, but does not regulate intermittent streams.
Okay. The letter that you read into the record mentions inconsistencies between the zoning bylaw and the Conservation Commission. What are those inconsistencies?
The ones that we're trying to amend.
That's these ones?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Comments, questions? Okay. Thank you all. Moving on to Article 20.
So Article 20 is for the review of religious and educational uses, otherwise known as the Dover Amendment, which is Section 3 of Mass General Law, Chapter 48. This article is intended to clarify an existing process of review and amending specific sections of our zoning bylaw to codify that process. Dover Amendment refers to certain protections that religious, nonprofit educational, and child care facilities receive under the Massachusetts Zoning Act, 48. It is not clearly described in our existing zoning bylaw. We actually became aware of this inconsistency during recodification. The bylaw appears to indicate at this moment in time that a special permit is required or otherwise the use is prohibited, which is not on par with how the law acts. So it creates a new section, or proposes to create a new section that would outline that review process. This new section is really driven by having worked with Town Council and the Inspectional Services Department on an appropriate process of review. What we are trying to codify is exactly that. And so it follows essentially two steps. The beginning step is a review by the building inspector to determine whether the religious, nonprofit, educational, or child care facility use is protected under 40A Section 3. And if it is, then that use goes through a complete administrative review by the Department of Planning and Community Development and applies the requirements that are allowed under 40A Section 3 as in reasonable regulations. And what is reasonable would be specific types of requirements that are currently in our zoning bylaw, including the bulk and height of a structure, determining yard sizes, lot area, open space, parking, building coverage requirements, etc. The applicant would have to provide those materials to our department and of course to inspectional services, but in our review as a department, we would have to work with that to see if the applicant can establish that the application of that regulation should be waived, reduced, or altered in any way as unreasonable given the specific facts that are provided to us. We would apply those reasonable regulations in accordance with the goals of the master plan or any other local plans and policies, which is the same language that we use in applying to other reviews that we conduct in the department. So with that, I may check to see if there's anything else that Doug wants to add or append to this discussion, if you want to stand here.
Jenny, I just add a few small notes. I think most folks are familiar to some degree with the Dover Amendment and its impact on our ability to regulate religious educational uses in childcare facilities. There are some important sort of developments that folks may or may not be familiar with. The first of which is that a series of cases, including the Bible, I think, Speaks case, if I remember correctly, noted that these reasonable regulations that we're allowed to impose with respect to bulk, height, parking, they can't be, reasonable is a fact-specific inquiry, and they can't be so onerous as to essentially frustrate the purpose of the religious or educational use. And probably the most dramatic example of this was in neighboring Belmont with the LDS temple. There was a prolonged litigation about the height of that building, and the short version of it is that the court essentially found that the regulation of height, while generally within this category of things that could be reasonable regulation, really didn't have a rational sort of anchor to it, like as to why in this specific case they should be regulating the height of the steeple of that temple, and how that was essentially impacting the community in a way that would make it reviewable under the Dover Amendment. So, and at the same time, we are allowed to do, some things. The kind of issue with our bylaw is that the way it currently reads, it sort of suggests that this is a special permit process, which is not something that we're allowed to engage in. And so this really clarifies and makes it a little bit more transparent the process by which we're determining, first, is this really a primarily religious educational use? Secondly, how are we applying these quote-unquote reasonable regulations in a way that's balanced to protect the community's interests without going so far as to totally frustrate the purpose of a legitimate, primarily religious or educational use? Do you guys have any questions or?
Go ahead, Gene.
I had a couple of comments. One comment, there are a lot of, and I've given this to the staff, but just to let the board know, there are a number of places, if you look at 3.5.1, for example, Aaron.
Yeah. 3.5.1.
3.5, thanks.
There you go.
So there are a lot of places where we use this phrase, the goals of the Arlington Master Plan or other development plans and policies of the town. But each time I really think it has to start with purposes of this bylaw, comma, the goals of the Arlington Master Plan. Because the first thing we have to do is make it consistent with the purposes of the bylaw, and the bylaw itself starts with what its purposes are. So I'd suggest that needs to get added. There are 3 or 4 places, I think, where that phrase is used. The second one, which I think is a discussion for the board to have is in 3.5.2B. So I think this is real interesting, and I'm not sure, I'm going to stand up to do this for a second. I'm not sure which is the right way, but I think it requires some board discussion. So the applicant initially goes to the building inspector, and the next step, it goes to planning and community development review, and the staff basically make a decision on how to apply this, and the only time the board gets involved is if the applicant doesn't like how the staff apply it, they can appeal to the board. To me, the real issue is, should this step be a staff step, or should this step be a board step? And I think that the board has to have that discussion.
So can we do that, could we do that step but not as a special permit process? Because the whole point here was taking this out of the special permit process.
I think we can, because these are the bylaws. This says what we can do. Do you disagree?
Well, there's sort of an organizational issue with the way the bylaw is constructed. So this is under a sort of EDR provision. And folks recall from the recodification process, something that was caught by Mr. Benson, that we wanted to make sure that there was some way of capturing what we're allowed to do, this reasonable regulation activity. But to call it environmental design review is a little bit imprecise, because you're implying that there's a sort of special permit process that's tied to it. There are communities that engage in a site plan review. They tend to be communities that have a different setup than the Arlington Redevelopment Board and our zoning bylaws have. So I wouldn't say that it's impossible that the board could conduct a version of site plan review, but I would say that it's difficult given the sort of organization and way in which we're trying to capture these types of activities under environmental design review. Jenny, does that capture from your...
It does, and just to ask Aaron, we did do a little bit of research on what other communities, particularly our neighboring communities, are doing about this and how that language fits into their zoning bylaws, so maybe we could just, I don't have the whole list.
Yeah, so I quickly looked at a few communities that are our adjacent neighbors. I looked at Cambridge, Somerville, Lexington, Winchester, and Belmont, and across the board, these uses, which are religious uses, nonprofit educational uses, and childcare facilities, which receive this protection under Section 3. In those 5 communities that I named, there's no review process. It's a permitted use across the board in all zoning districts. I will point out Cambridge, due to their significant institutional development through the universities in that community, they have an overlay district where the staff and the community are looking at the additional placement of those types of uses in a concentrated area. So I think that's a particularized issue in Cambridge that they're trying to address, but it's not a special permit process by any means.
And let me just say, I think this is an issue for the board, because the issue to me is who should be looking at these and determining whether the town is going to impose the controls that are allowed under the Dover Amendment. And should that be done by the staff, where the applicant, if it doesn't like what the staff has done, can appeal to the board? Or should it be the board that makes the decision on that? And it seems to me that we're not saying the board would issue a special permit, we're just putting the board in B rather than the staff in B. So assuming that that's legal to do, and I don't see why it's not, then I think the question is, who should be doing that work, the staff or the board?
Yeah, I think that, I want to be clear, I don't think it's a question purely of like, is it legal or is it not legal for the board to serve as the entity for doing that. I think the board certainly can serve as the entity for doing that, although the way that we've sort of, not just in the recodified version, but historically, the way we sort of set things up makes it a little bit logistically, or maybe not logistically, a little bit confusing to present a process that is primarily oriented towards, again, site plan review that we don't necessarily engage in this manner. I will say that the other piece of it, and this is more of a direct policy consideration for the board. So there are communities, Sudbury comes to mind, Concord, who have this planning board essentially serving this role to conduct a site plan review. And there's an asset to it. It's certainly a kind of a democratic process in a way. But there's also a liability to it as well, which is that the legality of those site plan reviews oftentimes hinges on this very sort of specific articulation of, oh, these bylaws say that you're doing it recognizing the limitations of Section 3 of Chapter 48. So it's a pretty fine line, and I think that the board should have a fully throated discussion about whether it wants to engage in that determination about whether or not these whether or not these regulations are reasonably being applied in these sort of religious contexts and educational contexts. So I don't want to present it as anything other than, of course, it's up to you. But we don't necessarily have a bylaw that's set up that it would sort of naturally flow right into that, I guess is the best way I can articulate it.
Gee, what if we leave it, I'm just talking right now, okay?
Don't talk for a second.
If we leave it this way, A and B, and leave it up to the petitioner, if there's some sort of disagreement, they have an option to go to the vote.
Well,
So that's
how
essentially
it
what
works
exists
now.
as is. I'd like to think about this some more, because I do like the idea of having some form of site plan review and notification of the butters, or at least involvement of the butters in that process for non-public comment, particularly given the size and density of some of these buildings and parcels. I think crafting a process to make sure that we were doing it in a legal way where we're not opening up the town to extra liability is probably part of the discussion that needs to be had.
I mean, perhaps if we inserted the board in B instead of the staff, we could do that through our rules and regulations.
We could.
But then, aren't we then deciding granting permission? I thought that was the whole purpose of it. They don't need to get our permission.
But we can, as
It's not-
the town council said, it's not permission, it's some control over height involved up to a reasonable amount.
It's advice from the board that's tasked with reviewing these.
But there's a process where first the applicant has to establish that they actually meet the threshold for protection under the Dover Amendment. Then we get to the question of, okay, which standards do we apply? And then we actually apply them. So there's 2 or 3 steps that have to be gone through, and would the board be doing all of those? Would petitioners be coming before us to establish that they are a permissible religious nonprofit or nonprofit educational or?
Well, this says the building inspector.
No, the building inspector would make that.
The building inspector would still make that?
The building inspector would.
That's
make
part
that
one.
determination. That's part one.
So
That's
they would
applying
do
state
part
law.
one.
Part
Okay.
2 would be applying the zoning bylaw to whatever it is that the proposal seeks to achieve. And that would be where this board comes in and acts in its role as planning board, doing a form of site plan review and allowing for neighborhood and townwide comment and input. It wouldn't necessarily be binding in a way because we can only go so far under 40A, but it would make sense to have some level of formal input over these projects.
guess, I don't know if you were planning to say something, but
Go ahead.
I'll go over here. I guess I think that it complicates things, what you're trying to do, based on what we're also trying to do here. If it's not a special permit process, but we would have a site plan review and it comes to the board, typically we would notify the abutters of a hearing process. So in this case, you're talking about abutters, but we wouldn't actually formally be notifying them. And we wouldn't be posting it as a public hearing.
Right.
We would not be advertising it as a legal notice, all of those steps. So you're simply asking for it to be, just so I understand, would you be asking for it to be an agenda item simply on your agenda and then you're posting? Because that's not the way we currently review things. So I'm trying to understand. And then that feels like, I guess, a larger issue perhaps for 3.4. It's almost like a separate type of review other than EDR just for these special uses. So I'm trying to understand how we would do it. Not the part about the building inspector making a determination, but what happens after that. And then specifically, what happens with abutters, because that is a whole legal process that we currently engage in during public hearings. I guess it kind of comes back to, if we're saying that yes, it's allowed in all districts, which is how our neighboring communities handle this particular use, I am trying to understand how to weigh board involvement in that, with that in mind, because that those two things feel in conflict, but I'm sure we can take this and figure out how we might handle it, but I'm just sort of responding to that kind of what I see as like a little bit of a conflict between what we're trying to do here, what you want to do, and then where we're actually making an amendment. I think we'd also have to amend 3.4 further in terms of here's an EDR review and here's a separate and even another separate review process. So I don't know if you want to add more.
The only thing I want to add to that, and I think that this is within the board's purview to decide how involved ultimately we want to be in this type of review process, is that we'll have to take a lot of care to make sure this is not a special permit under another name.
Right.
That's probably the most critical piece of it. And I think that's, I'll leave it at that.
So I think one of the interesting things to think about, which is why I sort of thought it was important to talk about this, is the point that the chair made, which is if this is done by the staff at the staff level, and then the applicant doesn't appeal, there's really no opportunity for public input. It's all sort of done at the staff level. However, if it's the board that does it, we can say it's going to be a public hearing and an opportunity.
Well, we can't say it'll be a public hearing, but it'll be an open meeting.
An open meeting.
Where it'll allow for comment.
Public comment,
Yeah.
right. So it's sort of the question of, is it enough for us to be sort of the appellate body and let the staff do this work and it'll be done without really necessarily any opportunity for public input? Or is it better for us to do the middle step? There'll be some public input, but there'll be no internal appeal, I guess, at that point. So I don't know what the right answer is. I just raised this so that we can...
Why don't we
get
table
around.
that? Well, go ahead, David.
Well, I think just in terms of the process, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of basically, as Gene suggested, we could do substituting the board into section B and just moving forward with this amendment without fully knowing what changes we'd need to make to our own regulations to implement this process, and being confident that that would work and that there wouldn't be any stumbling blocks to that process. So I would want to know up front before we made that commitment to changing the bylaw that the procedure would actually work.
Well, can we ask the staff and town council to craft an alternative that would put us
The other
into
thing I'm thinking of is before we do that, is just as a matter of practicality, if these items are going before staff, how many of them are going to end up appealing anyway and ending up before us? It could be all, it could be none, it could be somewhere between, and so that's something to think about and consider. Why don't we table this discussion further, because I want to get to the public in case they have comments or questions about this and keep things moving along. But I do think it's a discussion worth having. At our meeting on the 27th, we can get into the deliberation once edits are made. And I would like staff and town council to take a look at what might be done to help my work as a matter of practicality.
That was just me, I don't know if they were, can add anything to add.
I've said sort of already, I just don't, I don't want it to seem like we have to give approval for it because it says it doesn't have, doesn't it?
We wouldn't be giving approval, we would just, in some circumstances, be able to do a site plan review. Where's the building, what's the massing, things like that.
I wonder if there's a middle step where, as opposed to being an appellate body, if staff thought it would be helpful to refer certain cases to us at their discretion, where if things looked like they might impact some of the major corridors in town and a broader discussion was necessary, at that point they could refer to us for a decision, for a discussion.
Maybe the staff keeps them except for the ones that are on the corridors where we have jurisdiction and we do those. That would make this a bit more complicated.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I like that idea, thinking out loud, but.
Essentially the same.
I mean, it wouldn't necessarily just be a discussion, though. We would potentially be making decisions because there is the potential for reasonable regulation.
We would be, we would be making this, we
massing
would be making recommendations.
No, decision.
And decisions, but, and town council can correct me, but I don't think we're able to issue any sort of binding decision if what's been determined by the building inspector is correct. It would be more of an advisory role.
I think you're talking about potentially two separate things. So one is, who's going to make a determination as to whether this is primarily religious, educational, or childcare related use? And the second is the application of those reasonable regulations. We think it's reasonable that you have X number of parking spaces instead of the Y that would be strictly required under the zoning bylaw. So I do think that you would be making a determination with respect to, application of some of these regulations. Again, it's a super fact specific inquiry, so you'd have to potentially also make some findings as to, this is why we think that it would be unreasonable to apply a certain type of regulation to this specific project. This is why we think this number of, this height is reasonable in this specific situation. This is why it would be unfairly frustrating to this potential use to require A, B, and C. So you would be making determinations in the application of those regulations, and be issuing a form of a decision. It's not a special permit, but it is a form of a decision.
And that's actually, that process that Doug just outlined is the process that we've been using internally when we review these particular matters. So that we've already, again, with Doug's guidance, have developed this process and then an accompanying sort of form that we are able to use so that we're answering those questions as we move along through the process.
Okay. I'd like to look into a little bit more and get some more information about what's out there, what might be possible for us. So I'm going to move to the public on this, and for you, three of you. No. Okay. So if anyone has questions, same rules apply. Here's what's out here. Mr.
No one else.
No.
That's first. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Crystal Reddy, 56 Adams Street again. I have a number of problems, frankly, with this amendment. I appreciate that you're trying to be consistent with 48 Section 3. I don't think you are in a number of respects. First, I think you need to, the language for the exceptions and those types of uses that are exempt from the, within the building amendment should be consistent with the language of the amendment, and it's not. For example, one of the things that's listed is educational purposes on land owned or leased by the Commonwealth or any of its agencies, subdivisions, or bodies politic. I believe Arlington is a body politic. The Dover Amendment should apply, and the language here should reflect that it applies to town-owned public schools. I want that in there explicitly because the town, in fact, has violated the zoning bylaw in the past. For example, at Thompson School, it didn't bother to get any permission, didn't bother to get a variance when it exceeded some of the dimensional requirements. There's also another inconsistency pertains to this two-part test you have about whether the use is a principal use. Well, if you're opening a daycare facility in your house, it doesn't have to be a principal use. The language is explicit that for the primary, accessory, or incidental purposes of operating a child care facility, you're covered by the Dover Amendment. And the language here doesn't seem to reflect that at all. So I think that's another change that needs to be made. In terms of the whole administrative aspects of this, I frankly think you're making it much too hard. All the state is saying is that you can't require a special permit for these uses. And then it goes on to say, but you can have reasonable regulation on the dimensional requirements, parking, et cetera. Well, the reasonable requirements, as the planning director said, are what you've got written in your zoning bylaw. Those are enforced by the building inspector. So to the question of whether the planning department or your board should be doing that test, my answer is neither. That's not your job. That's the job of the building inspector, and that's why these other towns are doing it that way. The way it works is that, I believe, and if you checked with these other towns, that if the applicant wanted to build something that was larger than what the zoning bylaw said, then they would go to the Board of Appeals, and we have one of them in town. It's the Zoning Board of Appeals. And then they would be the ones to grant relief, either through a variance process or something similar. And that is, in fact, a public hearing process. It is advertised. People do get to speak at it. But that's the process for determining that reasonableness, if indeed the applicant wants to go beyond what's allowed by right for those dimensional requirements. I would also add that I think at the time that the bylaw was changed from the old version during the recodification process, you actually created some problems and took away rights that, say, I might have as a property owner in the R1 district. If I wanted to open a for-profit school and I own property in the R1 zoning district, I don't see that I could do that at all under the current bylaw. And I don't see that because you took out the special permit condition for schools in the R1 zoning district entirely. And the way to deal with this is to create the distinction between those uses which require the special permit and those which are protected by this Dover Amendment and don't require the special permit. And you list the ones that don't require the special permit as a yes in the use regulation tables, and those that do as a special permit as they do now. And then the yes ones, they would be handled as I was explaining, the way the other towns do it. Goes to the building inspector. He makes the determination whether the Dover Amendment applies. And if it does, then the normal dimensional requirements apply. And then if the applicant isn't happy, then as I said, it goes to the Board of Appeals. The other thing I find very strange about the way this is written now is this one thing that if the applicant doesn't like what the planning department has come up with, it goes to the redevelopment board or the Board of Appeals. Well, who decides? Do they get to do board shopping? And the other thing I'm not sure of is, as the redevelopment board, where do you get your authority to go beyond what the dimensional requirements are in the bylaw? And the boards of appeal have that power through the variance process. You guys don't have that. So it seems to me they are the appropriate board if it gets to the point where the applicant feels that these types of regulations are too onerous or not reasonable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for recognizing me. I'm Carl Wagner. I live on Edge Hill Road. I wanted to thank the Department of Planning and the folks that are on this board for the work and ACMi for doing the recording. If people have been watching here and on the really valuable ACMi coverage we have, will know that the earlier part of this evening is the great work you do. It's kind of tedious actually, but it's so important because it's the regulations. However, when I come to this item, I think this is the exciting part that is so valuable that the people are here for and that you're taking the time to ask, do we have this right on? I appreciate the questions members of the board had about this Article 20. The biggest concern I see is, as I read it, for a bunch of uses, the environmental review and the size, yard, lot, setback, open space, parking, and building coverage restrictions will be either lost or lost to the neighbors to come in and have more input into that process. Maybe I don't understand everything on it, but people really should know that, especially like the 11th and the 18th of March meetings, these kinds of things are coming up more and more, and this is the first one of them. So there's a great weight to be, if you can, a gatekeeper and consider the effect on the neighbors of these buildings that are going in, the neighbors of these lots. Arlington for the people who have to live in it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions on Article 20? Thank you both. Moving on to Article 22. Jenny and Aaron.
I'm not sure. These are essentially administrative corrections, as noted on the screen, that were typographical, 5 references to the pre-recodification zoning bylaw that obviously don't exist, need to be corrected, and then we found a couple of August 1975 references, but we needed the date, the 28th, not just the month and year to be added. So those are the amendments that are noted here.
I have no comments.
No? No. Public comment? Questions? Okay. Mr. Lorette.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Christopher Reddy, 56 Adams Street again. I do have one comment on the very last change that's proposed. First, as a threshold question, I don't see that change appears at all in the warrant article. And while I don't see the town moderator here, either I would respectfully submit that it is out of scope.
Chris, what's the citation to that one?
You have the papers in front of you.
It's on the screen.
It's on the, we just have to.
I don't have the warrant article in front of me.
Specific one? Oh.
It's the last one. I don't know. It's the last one that it's not listed in the warrant. It's the last one here.
So the dates.
But beyond that, I think there's some problems with this as well. One, it's in the wrong place. These citations, and this goes back to again the codification, should not be at the end of section 5.4.2. They should be at the end of section 5.4.3. And the reason is that these pertain to uses. And the next table is what relates to the table of uses in those areas. And so that's where these exceptions belong. What this is saying, and it took me about 10 times to read this, is the next table says that that C, item C, originally before the recodification, was to note that not only could you have detached single-family homes, you could have attached single-family homes. And it's in the wrong. It's not a dimensional and density requirement. It's a use issue. Similarly, under D now, if you now look at the table in the R0, R1, 2 districts, it looks like you can have one of these types of facilities there. In fact, D was meant to specifically restrict them and prohibit them unless this exception was made. And you have to go back and look at the bylaw before it's recodified to see that makes sense. Not entirely clear to me why the particular day is so important in that August back in 1975. I will note that you now have 2 different dates in the zoning bylaw. Some places say August 25th, some say August 28th. I frankly don't understand the significance or what difference it makes, but there is another section that pertains to these houses on Silk Street, and I'm not sure that was correctly translated from the old version of the bylaw either. So anyway, let me see. Yeah, it looks like it's, I have section 5.4.2.B2 is that other section. I believe. So anyway, I think this really needs to have another look taken at it, but I suggest that this has been there like for 50 or more years. It has never been an issue. I think you're probably better off putting it off till next year before you get it right. Thank you.
Questions?
I'm going to take a look at that too, because it got added very recently and I had not, had overlooked.
This was something that we caught. We did talk about it internally. We can, of course, clarify this with the moderator if you want to add this in.
Yeah, I need to, of course, it wasn't in the earlier draft, so I hadn't
No,
seen
it was not. No, it's Article 22 is written. We can scroll up on the slide. You can see how it's written. It does not include this, but it is an administrative correction. So we're glad to provide this material to John Leone, but we'll also investigate the other points that were raised.
Yeah, I also, the version that I was looking at did not include these.
Yeah,
so I
this
haven't
would have
seen
been
it.
in the, I think we provided, where is it? Something else with track changes.
It's in the track changes version
I
that
see the
I
track changes that I
downloaded
pulled from.
tonight. It
Yeah.
wasn't in the earlier version.
Attached to the
Yeah, it's actually
document.
why that the date so important. It wasn't like in the pre-codification.
It is in some references, as you noted, so we wanted to make that consistent. We realized it wasn't in the old bylaw, but we wanted to try to bring it up. That's the only reason, to make it consistent. So we can, again, investigate that further.
Mr. Revelak?
Just a clarification from Mr. Loretti. I believe the date is supposed to represent when the 1975 recodification was first advertised.
So does it make any difference with these paper properties? That's the question.
Oh, the with Sunnyside, Silk Street, et cetera, the
Yeah.
single-family house that's attached to another. Yeah, they were built in the 40s. But
All right. Moving on. I promise to allow for comments on any of the other articles for people who won't necessarily be able to be here on the 4th, 11th, 18th, the 11th, 18th, or the 25th. Just briefly, if you'd like to have a question, what will happen, we will, of course, have a formal public hearing each of those evenings and accept comments in writing.
Yeah, wait for the text.
All right. Moving on. Thank you all for coming. You can stay if you'd like. We have some other administrative business to attend to. So please keep it quiet as you leave the room. The public hearing will stay open until March 27th when further deliberations are on each article.
Are we actually going to vote on all of the articles on that one day?
Yes, that's what we decided.
So presumably we won't be doing a whole lot of deliberation.
We'll be doing some.
Or it will be a long meeting, too.
I think it'll be a
It is
little.
also not just necessarily for your deliberation, but also a public comment, might come in the form of emails or letters to the board or other kinds of things that you may want to take into consideration because the public hearing is open until it's officially closed.
So we may have more
So you may
material
have
to
more
review
material
at
to
that
work with
time.
other than
Yeah,
what
and I
was
think we
heard.
probably
But
will
we're not-
have,
we're not
even if
gonna-
not deliberation that leads to a vote, but more a discussion like we had with Joe Berman.
But we're not going to have public comment on the 27th. Public comment will be
Public comment will
closed
close.
as the previous meeting.
Yeah, I'll accept written comment for them, but not allow for any additional in-person comment. Just note these as received and get them off the record. So let's move on to our organizational meeting where we elect a chairperson and vice chairperson by our rules and regulations. We have a quorum.
And the member who is not here will not be serving on the board. So,
Yes.
There are nominations open.
Nominations are open.
I nominate Andrew Bonnell to be chairperson.
Second.
I accept. So, all in favor? Aye. Great.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's exciting to do it again. We need a vice chair. Vice chair? I nominate Kim Lau as vice chair.
Second.
Thank you.
All in favor? Aye. Right. Good. Congratulations, Kim.
Congratulations.
That was because of seniority.
Well, I don't,
Not that I know you're a good. That concludes the evening, so unless there's any other business, I entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
I
Aye.